get going. I have a lot of documents that I want to talk about. And so I'm just going to kind of start at the very, very beginning, and I'm going to jump kind of fast. And so if you have questions about stuff that I talk about, you're welcome to interrupt me. That's fine. We don't have a huge group, and so I think we can take questions as we go. If you want to talk about scenarios with transactions, let's kind of hold those to the end, and we can have a conversation about scenarios if we have time at the end. Okay, so first I want to talk about the listing documents. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with the listing documents. You know, when you go into your zip forms, obviously you have like a gazillion forms that you can choose from up here in your zip forms, all under the CAR library, right? And so these are all of the zip form forms. There's tons. We're going to kind of scroll through those today, and I'm going to talk about the most important ones. But you'll see, obviously, that the two that we always use are at the very top, the listing agreement and the RPA. Okay, so today we're going to start with the listing agreement. I'm not going to go through it line by line because it would take too much time. But what I really want to point out to you guys is the stuff that people miss the most often from a compliance point of view, and stuff that you need to think about when you're talking to your seller clients and how you need to fill out this contract. So I'm going to skip over all the generic stuff. We already know that we have to do the wire fraud and the privacy, but here's your listing agreement, okay? Obviously, you're going to fill all this stuff in. The thing that people usually forget the most is going to be the APN, and so you're going to want to always make sure you have that. You obviously need to have your listing price. Don't put to be decided, TBD. You definitely have to have a price in order to have a valid listing, and you can't use a range. Okay, you can only put a number. And so if you want to discuss with your seller client that maybe you're going to list it and adjust your price once the preparations are done, it's totally fine to write in here under listing terms, you know, asking price will be reevaluated prior to putting the property in the MLS. Okay, or prior to doing any marketing. So if you don't know for sure, just put a price, but then reserve the right to reevaluate that when the property goes in the MLS. Okay, so you just can't put to be decided. Don't forget to put your commission. This is your total commission. Okay, split between both brokers. So you're going to have to put, you know, hopefully 6%. Or 5% or whatever the total commission is. The spot where you're going to put your split to the other party, the cooperating party, is down here. Okay, this is your cooperating party split here. Okay, so usually we try to put 2.5% here because we want to put it in the MLS with about 2.5%. We try not to go any lower than that to the cooperating party because we don't want to be perceived as a discount brokerage. Obviously, if it's a 2% or 1.5%, you know, we're not going to tell you can't take that listing, but we would prefer that we are staying with a 2.5% to the cooperating broker. Okay. The other thing I want to say that's really important is this number right here. Within however many calendar days, if for some reason this listing doesn't sell, okay, and it's very rare that that happens because of course we have a really active market and most of our listings sell. However, if in some circumstances, if your listing doesn't sell, you want to reserve the right to be able to present your seller client with a list of names, okay? And so this basically says after the end of the listing period or after the cancellation of this agreement, if a seller enters into a contract to sell, convey, lease, or otherwise transfer the property to anyone, a prospective buyer, or that person's related entity or a relative who physically entered and was shown the property during the listing period and whom broker any cooperating broker submitted a signed written offer. Seller shall, however, not have an obligation to pay this commission unless no later than the end of the listing period of any extension or cancellation that the broker has given the seller a written notice of the names of prospective buyers. Okay, so I'm just going to explain why this is important to us, because say that you are showing a property, you're getting pretty good activity. You want to be keeping track of the names of the agents who are showing the property, and you definitely want to try and be getting the names of the buyers. Keep good notes of who's entering the property, who the buyers are, who their agent is. Because if for any reason that listing goes away, maybe the sellers decide that they want to cancel on you, you need to give them this list of names of prospective buyers who entered the property, and you have to give it to them no later than the end of the listing period. Okay, so I usually put 90 days here. Some people like to put 180 days, that's 6 months. And so this basically reserves your right to claim a commission if that seller goes ahead and sells it to someone who came through that property while you had that listing. Okay, now a lot of agents miss this, but it's really important that you have a number on there. Okay, so, don't forget to make sure that the seller has the right to sell. Don't forget exclusions and inclusions. Don't forget to ask if there's any leased or liened items. This is where you put in your MLS, and this is where you talk to the client about, making sure that they're putting it on the market. If they're not going to put it on the market, then they have to do this SELM form. Okay, and then that's where you're going to decide if you're going to put it on the market at a certain date, or if you are never going to put it on the market. Okay, and so this is where I'm going to jump over to our next form at this point, because I'm not going to go through the rest of the listing agreement. I have a lot to get through. If you guys have specific questions on this listing agreement, then you can ask me and we'll jump back to this after. But it's a good segue to go over into our next form. And this is the SELM form. Okay, and this is the form that you should be taking when you get a listing. Now, this is something that I always include whenever I take a listing, because my MLS in San Francisco in Marin requires that if I sign a listing, I have to have it in the MLS within, I think, 3 days. And you are rarely able to put a listing in the MLS within 3 days, because you definitely have lead time. You're going to have to sign the listing, and then you're going to have to get photographs taken, and then you're going to have to get the preparation done before you get the photographs, and then you're going to have to get the flyers done, and marketing needs to be created. So it's very, very rare that you take a listing and you put it in the MLS within 3 days. And so we always use SELM, always. Okay, it's just one of the things that's part of my routine. This basically says that, we are going to be getting this listing, we're going to sign it up, put the seller's name, put your MLS. I'm sure most of you guys know what this is. And this is where it says that we definitely have a clear cooperation policy, whether or not it's required. Some MLSs do not belong to the clear cooperation policies. For instance, Marin Association of Realtors, where I live, they don't belong to NAR. So they actually don't have to abide by the clear cooperation policy. Most of the time they do, but they're not required to. Just a little bit of not gossip, but knowledge to share there. So you're going to want to talk to the seller about the timeframes for getting your property ready. And this is where you're going to decide. Usually you're going to use this paragraph right here where it says seller's instruction to broker to exclude the property from the MLS. And this is where you put do not market the property immediately, and then you begin marketing it on a date, or you do not market the property to the public during the entire listing period. Okay, so that means that's pocket listing. It's never going to go on the MLS. Okay, and you're never going to go out to the public. So that's really not in the seller's best interest, right? Because you want to have the most most number of eyeballs and the most number of people, prospective buyers, looking at the property. So you definitely want to put it on the MLS. But sometimes you might get perhaps a client who is very concerned about privacy and they don't want to put it on the MLS. So this is where you would mark the box on when you want to put it on the market. And it's totally okay right here if you don't put a date. You're allowed to write off to the side. You can use your DocuSign text or a text field, and you can put upon written instruction by seller. Okay, so you don't actually need to have a date if you don't know a date. Because perhaps you don't know how long it's going to take the seller to get the property ready. So you can write upon written instruction by the seller. Okay, and that would be sufficient for our files and for our compliance department, as the fact that you definitely have this SELM, but you are basically saying that you're reserving to right to put it on the market when the seller gives you permission.
But
Okay.
is this same as coming soon?
It is the same as coming soon. However, I want to make sure that coming soon statuses, you need to check with your individual MLSs, okay? Because each individual MLS in the whole entire state and your association rules that you belong to, they're going to have their own rules for coming soon. And I'm hesitant to give a broad statement regarding coming soon because it may not apply to you in your specific area.
Yeah, I think in
Okay.
Southern California, I don't think you could do coming soon. I haven't been there in a while, so I'm not sure if that's changed.
Yeah,
It can be
exactly.
for a
I
very
know.
short period of time.
Yeah. And
Oh,
so you really need to know the rules of what your local association has regarding coming soon listings. Okay. Right. I know a lot of people in San Francisco, yes, they, especially in my market, they'll go ahead and they'll put their listing in the coming soon category. And that is sufficient for them in order to put a sign up and start marketing it. They can do that as long as it's in the coming soon category in the MLS. Okay, so what happens in my market is a lot of people just put their listings in coming soon and they get offers from that and they never even move it over into the active category. Okay, it's really common. So if you want to have a listing and put it in a coming soon, my advice would be to just check the rules in your specific association and MLS. Okay. Next form, you guys, because I have a lot, and this is following right along with having a listing. We have this, let's see, this is the RCSD, okay, and this is the buyer version, and we have an RCSD seller version, okay, and a lot of agents miss the RCSD because here's the seller RCSDS and then RCSDB. And what this is when you have a client, whether it's a seller or a buyer, if your client is an entity, okay? And so it means that if the client is a trust, a corporation, an LLC, a partnership, or maybe a power of attorney or an estate, that entity, the title is within that entity who holds title. And then you have to have a person, a real life person who has the power to sign. And so that's what the buyer representative signatory capacity form is for, is you're basically saying, here's my, I have this agreement and this person is identified as a buyer. So perhaps it's like, you know, the Joe Brown Trust dated 1998. Okay, because usually when you have a trust, they're going to have a date, and that's where you would put in here the name of the trust. And then you're going to say, if it's a trust, you need to identify the buyer is the trustees. Okay, here's an example. And then you need to put the name down at, this is where you put the name of the trust. And then down at the bottom, this is where you're going to put the representative's name of whoever has the signing capacity for that trust or that LLC or that or corporation or whatever it is. Okay, so you're using this form to tie the entity with a person who can sign. Okay, and so for a buyer signatory capacity, the title company is probably going to, and for the seller signatory capacity, the title companies are probably going to want to see a document that proves that that signer has the capacity or that right to sign. Okay, and so here's where you would, at the time of the sale, the buyer and the seller are parties to the purchase agreement, and this is where the seller would sign it. So that's when you're making an offer, because this is the buyer version. And then this is if you're having the buyer sign a buyer representation agreement, this is where the buyer would sign it if you're using it at that point. This is where if you're using it and you're assigning a contract, this is where the buyer and the assignor and the seller would sign, or any other time of agreement. So these different boxes are for your different situations. Okay, it can be a little confusing. So you have to figure out which situation you have, and that's the box that you're going to have the other party sign it. Okay, same thing for the seller reps. Okay, you're going to fill it out just the same way. What's the name of the entity and what type of entity? You're going to, here's your seller's signatory name right here. And then once again, this is what you're going to get done when you take the listing. And then this is when you put this in your disclosure package, and then this is going to get done at the time of sale or any other agreement. Okay.
So if you have multiple signatories, so you get or each of them to sign.
Really good question. Actually, let's scroll down to one of our other forms because I was going to talk about that. So this is a good segue. Let me scroll over to the next, since you asked that question, we're going to go through some of these. We'll come back. If you have multiple signers and they don't fit because, you know, our forms have lines for 2 people, you're able to use the form, and I think, oh, this isn't it. Okay, let me go to my zip forms over here. Let's do additional, I think it's additional signature. Additional signature addendum right here. Okay, and so this is going to be a form that you would use when, say that you have 3 or 4 people who you have to fit all of their signatures on a document. Okay, this is the additional signature addendum that you would use, and you would fill it out because you have to say what it's pertaining to. It can pertain to a contract or a listing agreement or any other document. And then you would obviously fill out the relevant information, who the parties are, and then by signing below, the undersigned acknowledges receipt of the document identified above and, except as specified below, agrees to the terms, conditions, representations, and disclosures in that document. Okay, so this is where you could add other parties, additional signature parties. But I want to just make one thing really clear, you guys, is this document rides along with another document. Okay, and so this document can be used one time, okay, with the original document that you're referencing. And so it can get a little confusing because people sometimes say, well, obviously I have a transaction with 4 sellers and I already signed this additional signature addendum once when I made them do the listing agreement. And I'm like, well, you need to do an additional signature addendum every single time you have a contract document. Okay, so you're going to need another one for the RPA. Okay, you're going to need another one for any addenda. You're going to need another one, you know, for any, you know, notices to perform and stuff like that. So this form is a form that rides along with another form all the time. Okay, any contract document. So it can get a little confusing. You can use this, you know, different versions of this, you know, for your RPA or another version of this for an addendum, okay? But I do want to make a point. It's actually perfectly okay to try to fit 3 or even 4 signatures in on your forms, okay? Even though there's only 2 seller lines on your listing agreement, there's only 2 seller lines on your purchase contract. If it's possible, you can definitely have 3 people sign documents, or even 4 people. As long as everything is legible, you can have everybody sign the documents. You don't have to use the ASA form, okay? They just do this because they want it to be legible. They want it to be clear, all right? Keep in mind.
That's very possible. It is possible because I had 4 buyers.
Yeah.
And I was able to put 4 buyers in. Yeah, it's workable.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so you can do it, and because you have to remember that if you have 4 buyers, they all have to sign every disclosure, right? You know, so every time you're getting them to acknowledge a disclosure, every time you're getting them to acknowledge a report, you know, the cover sheet of a home inspection or the cover sheet of a pest inspection, you know, you need to have all of the people who are parties to that contract on all of the documents.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
And so that was a good segue into this additional signature addendum, because this is one that you can use just to make sure that things stay legible. Okay. Let's go back to the forms that I kind of queued up. We were on the RCSD. I'm going to get to some of the more confusing ones in just a second, like the request for repairs. All right, we did the RCSD. Let's see, computer. modification of listing, buyer representation, or other agreement. Okay, so this one gets used a lot if you have a modification of a listing. If you have a listing, okay, and say that you want to change the price, or you want to change the term, you want to extend your listing. Okay, so this is what you use, MOT or MT, modification of terms or modification of terms right here. So this is where you would say, hey, I have a listing, we're going to reduce the price. This is where we reduce the price. Or if we want to extend our listing time frame, we're going to add another month or two. This is where we put our new expiration date. Okay, and so this is basically, you can use this also for a buyer rep. If you have a buyer representation agreement signed with your buyer, or any other agreement between the principal and a broker. Okay, so this is a document that's between the broker and the client. Okay, it's not between the buyer and a seller, it's between the broker and the client. Okay, so that's the form that you would use to either, you know, change or modify the agreement between you and a client. All right, next form, contingency for the sale of the buyer's property. This is a confusing one. People use this all the time. You know, obviously, if you have a buyer and they're trying to buy, or they want to move up to a larger house, but they have to maybe sell their smaller house first. So they want to make a contingent offer. In a multiple offer situation, in a really active market, sometimes, you know, making a contingent offer is going to put you at the bottom of the barrel as far as, you know, competition goes, obviously, but definitely in some circumstances, especially if maybe the house has been on the market for a long time and the sellers are willing to take a contingent offer, this is the form that you use. Okay, so this is actually an addendum to the purchase agreement. Okay, or you could write in here, for instance, San Francisco has its own contract, so you could put San Francisco purchase agreement, whatever it is, but this is an addendum to a purchase agreement. And this is where you fill in all of the information regarding the property. Okay, and then this is where it says that the buyer has a contingency, and this agreement is contingent upon the buyer entering into a contract for the sale of and closing escrow on buyer's property. Okay, so this is, you know, this is for the buyer's exiting property. Okay, and so you have to decide what scenario is going to work for you, because you have to decide, is it contingent on entering into a contract and closing escrow, or is it only entering into a contract or only the close of escrow? Okay, so most people are going to just go ahead and leave this like this, and they're not going to choose B or C because they want to, you know, close that escrow. They have to close their escrow in order for them to buy the next property financially, right? And so most people usually just don't check either one of these. However, in certain circumstances, you already could be in contract. So say that that property that the buyer has on the market is already in contract. And so that's when they would go ahead and they would do this part, because it's already in contract. So now they're just gonna, it's only contingent on them closing escrow with that property that's already in contract. Okay, so this can be kind of a confusing form. Make sure that you're understanding which choice, because if it's already in escrow, then you're going to put here, it's already in escrow with the escrow company and the escrow number, right? And so most of the time, if you are making a contingent offer, you want to reassure that listing agent that that buyer's property is going to sell, right? You know, if they have it on the market already, that they should be asking a realistic price, and that, you know, our market is active enough that that property is going to sell in order for this deal to go forward. Okay, so sometimes the listing agent, if you're making this contingent offer, is going to say, hey, is it already in escrow? And if it is, where are you in your timeframes? Are you non-contingent? You know, so that listing agent may want a lot of information about your other transaction, right? Okay. That's why a copy for the contract is included, or it will be delivered to this seller within however many days of acceptance, right? So that's that listing agent asking you for some sort of proof that that buyer's exiting property is in escrow, okay? buyer entering into the contract for the sale of the buyer's property, if 1A or 1B applies, buyer shall have 17 days after acceptance to enter into a buyer. And so they're basically saying, if it's not yet in contract, we're going to give you 17 days to get that property into contract. Okay, and this is where you can adjust this. You could put 30 days to get it into contract, or you could put 5 days to get it into contract. You know, it depends on your situation, right? And then once again, you're going to have to deliver evidence to deliver escrow evidence to the seller showing that, okay, now we're in contract on my exiting property. Here's the evidence that we're in contract. Okay. This is where you would write listing an MLS status. If 1A or 1B applies, buyer has signed a listing agreement, or buyer's property is or will be submitted into the MLS. And buyer shall deliver to seller evidence of both the listing agreement and the MLS listing within 1 day. Okay. This is a really confusing form because you have to keep referring back to your situation here, and that says close of escrow of buyer's property. If 1A or 1C applies, buyer has until the following time to close escrow on the sale of buyer's property. Okay, when is it going to be? It's going to be the scheduled close of the escrow of seller's property simultaneously closing, or is it going to be no later than 5 days prior, okay, the scheduled close of this property that we're negotiating for? Okay, once this property closes, the buyer can no longer use this contingency to cancel this agreement. Okay, because remember, this is a contingency. In addition to your regular contingencies, you're putting in this sale contingency. Okay. Status of sale of buyer's property. Buyer agrees to keep seller informed of the status and update them in terms of offer delays and removal of contingencies on the exiting property. Within 2 days after seller's written request, but no earlier than the applicable time to remove contingencies in the contract, buyer shall deliver to seller evidence of removal of those identified contingencies. Okay. This is the cancellation of buyer's property. If buyer's property is in or enters escrow and either party to that escrow gives the other notice of cancellation, the buyer will notify this seller of the cancellation. Okay, remember, it's a trickle down. You have to, what's happening in this transaction is going to affect what's happening in the other transaction. This is the part where people get confused right here most of the time, because this is reserving the right to take backup offers. Okay, and so obviously from a seller's point of view, the seller really wants a solid contract, right? Obviously, but the buyer is going to want to have a little bit of flexibility, and that's where you guys are negotiating, like how you're handling the seller's ability to continue to market the property for a backup offer, because they can go ahead and they can get into contract with this contingent buyer, knowing that buyer's got to sell another property. But that means that this seller wants to continue to market this property in order to get a backup offer, because maybe they'll get a backup offer that won't have a contingency of sale. And so this is where you're going to set forth how the seller is going to be allowed to do that. Okay, so backup offers. After acceptance, seller shall have the right to continue to offer seller's property for sale for backup offers. Okay, so that's basically saying the seller is allowed to do that. Okay.
Is that usually until the closing escrow?
Well, it's until this buyer removes this contingency.
Oh,
okay, so that's the next couple of paragraphs have to do with the right to continue to market the property. Okay, so removal of buyer contingencies, unless 7C3 is selected, if seller accepts a written backup offer and provides buyer a copy of the signed accepted backup offer within the time specified in 7C1 or 2, going back up here, 7C, I'm sorry, down here, 1 or 2, that's what they're referring to. Seller shall have the chance or the right to give buyer a written notice to perform, to remove this contingency. Okay, and so that means that, say that this seller gets a second offer and they don't have this contingency in it, and this seller really wants to work with that second buyer, they could go to this buyer and they can say, hey, we're going to give you a notice to perform, and we want you to remove this sale contingency. Okay, and that means that this buyer can either choose to move forward and remove the sale contingency, but they would probably be in trouble if they couldn't perform, but they don't have the money, they have to sell the other property, right? And so this right here is the time frame to give notice. And so sellers shall have the right to invoke the notice provision immediately, anytime after acceptance, or a delayed right no earlier than 17 days, or you will never have the right to notify or invoke 7B. Okay, so here's a question, you guys. If you're representing a buyer making a contingent offer, which one of these, 1, 2, or 3, is in the best interest of the buyer? You guys. Okay, which one of these do you want if you're representing a buyer? Anybody?
Number 2.
Number 2 is a good answer, but it's not the best answer, because number 3 is the best answer. You
Okay.
never want to be given the notice to perform and remove this contingency. Okay, you always want to be able to be the primary buyer, and you don't want the seller to kick you out. Okay, and so if I'm representing a buyer and I'm using this form, because I'm obviously have to have this scenario, I'm going to check this box right here, no right to notify the buyer, because I don't want that seller to ever come to me and say, oh, I have a backup offer, which I'm really interested in taking, so I'm going to give you a notice to perform to remove your sale contingency. Okay, I don't want that to happen, right? Okay. However, from a seller's point of view, the seller definitely wants number 1, right? Because the seller says, if I get a better offer, and I want to be able to come to you and say, hey, I want to, give you a notice to perform to remove this contingency. And so therefore, they can kick you out if you don't remove the contingency and take the other offer. Okay. And so this is why it's a confusing form, and this is why it's really important if you're using this form to pay super attention to these 3 options right here. Okay, regarding when is that seller going to have the ability to, to give you a notice to perform and probably perhaps kick you out of contract because they got a better offer. All right. So does anybody have any questions? I know I went really fast, but this is one of the most confusing forms out there. And if you do have a scenario where you're going to be using the COP form, definitely please, reach out to me, or, I will help you fill this out, or any other senior agent or whatever. Okay, because this is a hard one. I'm going to look at the chat. Tatiana said, question about a listing agreement. Seller wanted to put listing price TBD and decide on a price later. Is that okay to do? I answered that question. You cannot put to be decided. You have to have a number on a listing agreement, but you can write in purchase price to be reevaluated prior to marketing the property. Okay. Okay. Number 3. Good job. Okay. All right. Let's keep going, you guys. And we'll go to the next one. Next confusing document. Read all of this. This keeps going back and forth. This is where it has to do with the seller right to cancel and the notice to perform. All right. And then the other thing about timeframes for performance of contractual obligations and delivering of the buyer's deposit. And so this is where you're going to have to choose, when do these contract obligations start, right? Because usually the buyer's initial deposit has to be in escrow within 3 days, I believe. Or when does your inspection timeframe actually start? Are you going to go forward with this transaction in these timeframes and start immediately doing your inspections? Or are you going to wait until that buyer's exiting property is in escrow? Okay, so you have to determine when are the timeframes going to start. Okay, and so here, this is where you say the contract obligations other than the deposit Time periods in the agreement for inspections, contingencies, covenants, close of escrow, and other obligations, excluding those in this addendum, shall begin as specified in the agreement, or right here, on the day after buyer delivers to seller any of the following escrow evidence for buyer's property, buyer's election to begin the time periods, or buyer's removal of this contingency. Okay, so this is other than the deposit. Actually, buyer's deposit shall be delivered to escrow within the time specified, or within 3 days, or when other things are going to happen. So a lot of the timing on these contingency situations are dependent on the time of the contract in front of it, right? And so that's why it's really important when you're doing this to make sure that you're understanding the form and you're filling it out the right way, and so that your clock doesn't start ticking on your inspections and your loan contingency and your appraisal contingency until you're ready for that clock to start ticking. Okay. Next form, you guys, this is the extension of time. I think this one's pretty simple and straightforward. This is a term that can be incorporated into any bunch of different forms: the RPA, the manufactured home purchase agreement, the probate purchase agreement, or the residential income. So basically, this is an extension of time. Okay, and this is a form that it's going to be between the buyer and the seller, right? The other one, remember, we talked about modification of terms. That's between the client and the broker. Okay, this one is between the buyer and the seller. And this is basically where you're going to say, hey, I need more time to close escrow. I need more time for my contingencies, or any other things, that we've negotiated, or any other additional terms right here regarding extension of time. Okay, so this isn't something that you're really going to use to put into writing any type of contract price adjustment or anything like that. This is to do with time only. Okay, if you're going to do any kind of amendment to the contract in the terms, then you're going to use a different form for that. All right. This is another form that people have questions on all the time, and this is the multiple counter offer form. And so yes, it is true that a seller can counter more than one offer at a time. The seller can counter as many people at a time as they want. Say that they got like 5 offers and they want to issue 5 multiple counter offers, they can do that, right? This is the form that they would use. They are able to counter each one of those different offers with different terms. It doesn't have to be the same across the board. Okay, so they can look at each contract and they can write a counter offer for each different person. And this is the form that they would use. And this alerts you as a buyer's agent that you are not the only person that they are countering. Okay. And so this is where the seller would go ahead and write the terms. But this is what's confusing to people, is they're like, well, if they issue a bunch of multiple counter offers, what happens if my buyer signs it and another buyer signs it? Well, aren't they in contract twice? And so, no, that's not true, because if you look at this form, this is one of those forms that goes back and forth between the parties more than once. Okay, it goes to from the seller to the buyer, right? And this is where they would put in the terms, they would put in the expiration, they would put it, any other thing that they want to write, and then they would give you a time frame to get back to them. This right here is the acceptance, where the buyer accepts it, or subject to another counter offer. I don't know what my yellow is doing that. So this is where the buyer replies. Okay, so then the buyer goes ahead and either signs it, or they check the box and they counter back to the seller. And then guess what? Then the seller has to go ahead and sign again right here. And if the seller chooses this one, then this is where it says the seller, by signing below, the seller accepts it. Do not sign this box until after buyer signs paragraph 7. Okay, and so the seller makes the multiple counter offer, the buyer accepts it or counters it, and then the seller goes ahead and signs it again, saying, I've chosen you. And then this at the bottom is where you get the confirmation of acceptance personally received by the buyer or the buyer's authorized agent, okay? Binding agreement is created when a copy of the signed seller selection is personally received by the buyer or buyer's authorized agent, okay? So look at this document goes back and forth between the parties 1, 2, 3, 4 times at least, right? Okay, so this can be a little confusing if you've never used a multiple counter offer form before. That's how this one works. All right. Questions? Everybody good? Tatiana, regarding the contingency of a sale of buyer property, is there a place to put a time frame to sell the buyer's property? Yes, we just went through that. There is a place to put a time frame for selling the buyer's property. I can go back and scroll. Regarding a multiple counter offer, seller countered all other offers except mine. I am concerned and I am being left out. Yeah, we can touch on that. So Tatiana had a situation recently where she submitted an offer, and I think you said there were what, like 4 or 5 offers, and they called her, they called you, right, and said, we're going to counter all these other people, but we're not countering you.
Right.
Right. And what happened with that? I know you called me to chat about it. What happened
today?
with that?
They should call me and tell me what's going on, but I still don't get it. You know, they left me out, and then they told me that we will counter you if someone comes to the better price than yours. And I just still don't feel like very easy with this situation. Like, what?
Yeah.
So they have a choice: either select one of those offers and just don't select mine at that point, right? They have no obligation to counter me. I only have the word of this listing agent that he will, but he doesn't have to, right?
No, I mean, I know we talked a little bit about, you know, what I might do.
Yeah,
when
and I
have
did
clients.
it, and he just like, he didn't go for it. Yeah.
You tried to shorten your time frame for responding,
yeah,
and
yeah.
he didn't go for it.
Yeah, he told me, well, this is a fiduciary duty of the trustee, and she decided to take this calculated risk losing your offer for the sake of having another offer coming up to your price. And it just it does make sense. So just take my offer if it's good, you know?
Right.
Whatever.
I hate that. That means obviously that listing agent is going to everybody else and saying, hey, can you match or beat this number?
Yes.
Right.
It's unfair.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I guess you could decide that you don't want to work with an agent or a seller in that situation, and you could withdraw your offer, right?
No, I didn't. The buyer didn't want to withdraw it. He's still like, he's standing. So I'm waiting today by 3 o'clock for the agent to get back to me. But you know, I'm still confused. So he can just choose the other offer and not to counter me, right?
He can. Yeah, he could choose that.
Yeah, it's just like, so then I have no recourse, right? I just like left out.
The only recourse you would have would be to tell him that if another offer comes in that's better, that you could, you know, maybe you would consider, or your client would consider matching it if they were to give you proof. You know, I mean, it depends on how badly your client wants the
I told him
property.
that. I told him that. Yeah. And he said he will, but I have like nothing in writing. I just have his word, and you know, and he's a writer's agent as well.
There's really nothing that you can do as far as a buyer to like force a seller to take your offer.
I never been to a situation like that. Okay,
It's not as an unfortunate situation, and I would say is like, let's not be agents who do that to other agents. That's all.
Right.
You know?
Right.
Okay, we're going to move on. Amendment. So a lot of agents have questions regarding what's the difference between an amendment and an addendum. Okay. Because in zip forms, you can choose to either write an addendum to a contract, or you can choose to write an amendment to an existing terms. You know, so preferably, okay, preferably the right way to do it is if you already have a contract it's been fully executed, signed by all parties, and you want to change something, okay. The right way to do it is to use an amendment form. Okay, so say perhaps you're changing the price, or you're changing a term of the contract, okay? You should be using an amendment. Although I'm going to say 99% of the agents use an addendum, okay? And so, you know, we're not going to kick it back to you if you use an addendum versus an amendment, but an amendment is actually the correct way to change the terms of an existing agreement, all right? And so, once again, you know, this is where you would fill it out. This is a proposal to amend the terms and conditions of the following existing agreement, okay? And so just keep in mind, you know, if you use an amendment, there's an expiration time frame to it, okay? Because say that your buyer is proposing a price adjustment, they can say that the buyer or the tenant proposes this amendment of existing terms, which may be withdrawn by the party initiating the proposed amendment at any time prior to acceptance, okay? So basically, what if your buyer's like, well, I propose to amend our price by $10,000, and the seller's not really open to that, and so that they could say, hey, I'm proposing to amend the price. The seller's like, no, I'm not going to do it, and so then the buyer could be withdrawn. So this amendment could be withdrawn, this proposal, or the shall be deemed revoked unless by 5 p.m. on the third day it is signed by the initiating party and this proposed amendment is signed by the other party. So you know, just keep in mind, if you're proposing to change the terms of a contract, this is where it's saying that, you know, we're going to go ahead and ask for it. But if the seller or the other party doesn't want to do it, then you could go backwards and you could withdraw this, you can withdraw the amendment, right? I think that's maybe why it's confusing to people that they don't use this, because why would they want to withdraw the amendment? You know, maybe you've already negotiated a term, or you've gone through a request for repair negotiating, and now you're going to put something into contract. Well, you don't want to give them the right to amend it, okay? And then this is where the other party would accept it or reject it, all right? And so if you want to use an amendment, that's great. Just, you know, understand that if the other party doesn't agree, then they don't sign it, then it's not fully executed and it's not part of your contract, okay? So that's going to kind of roll us right over here to a request for repair. And this is another one of those forms that goes back and forth a bunch of times, okay? This is what I call an action form, because it's the form that we're using as a vehicle to make something else happen, okay? So usually, say that you're representing a buyer and you're going through your inspections and you found out that perhaps, you know, the roof needs to have some maintenance, or there's other things that you would like to request. So you can either request a repair or other corrective action. Okay, this is the form that you use to request something. And so this is where you would put your buyer request. Okay, and note, seller has no obligation to respond. This is just a request. Okay, this is where it says that buyer requests that seller, prior to final verification of condition, repair or take the other specified action. Okay, so either you're repairing something, and this is where you're going to write in here what the repair is. And usually if you're asking for a repair, you're attaching the report where you got that information from. So say the roof needs to be repaired. Well, then attached is your roof inspection showing that the roof needs to be repaired. Or you can ask that the buyer requests to have pay section 1 work completed as specified in the PEST report. You can ask that the buyer request seller to pay the section 2 work completed, or you can ask the buyer request for credit, or you can ask the buyer request for the seller to reduce the price. Okay, so this gives you all these options on like, what is it that your buyer is asking that seller to do? And most of the time, I'm going to say that we see a price reduction, probably most of the time. And then sometimes we see a credit, okay? And then sometimes we see a request for repair, depending on what it is. What I want to point out though is if you do get a credit, you want to make sure that any credit included in this paragraph is a separate from and shall not reduce or supersede any other credit which already been negotiated. Okay, so say that you've already negotiated prior to this request, you've already negotiated a price reduction or something like that, or a credit. So they had to kind of separate that to make sure that they're keeping the credits separate. And so each party realizes what each credit is for. Okay. And you want to make sure your credits are disclosed to the lender. Don't go ahead and agree to a credit without telling the lender. That's a huge, big problem if you don't tell the lender and you get all the way to the close of escrow and the loan documents are there for your buyer to sign. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, but what about the $10,000 credit? And you didn't tell the lender and you didn't give the lender the addendum. Well, don't forget about, telling the lender. So if you go ahead and you get a credit, or if you get a purchase price, or, you're going to want to put that in a separate document. Okay. This is where the buyer asks for something. And then right here in the middle, this is the seller's response. Okay, so the buyer asks for something, the seller responds. And this is where the seller says they either agree, provided that the buyer's request provided in writing, see below, provided that the buyer removes the physical inspection contingency, or buyer removes the contingencies in the identified on the attached contingency removal form. So let me chat about this really quickly because this is where this form gets a little confusing, okay? The buyer is requesting something. The seller says, okay, I'll go ahead and agree to your request, but because I'm agreeing to your request, I want you to remove this contingency, okay? And so this is that form that is like an exchange. Okay, this is the vehicle that provides that exchange, because if you don't use the request for reform and you just use a request for repair and you just use an addendum, and you say to the seller, hey, sign this addendum to give me $10,000 price reduction, and then I will remove my contingency. Well, the seller doesn't want to do that sometimes because they want you to remove the contingency at the same time in order for them to sign the agreement for the the $10,000 price, the credit. And so this is the form that says, if you do this, then I will do that. Okay, so this is the form that you use to exchange something for something else. And so when the seller responds and says, okay, I'm going to agree to your request, but I want you to remove your contingency, that is supposed to have a contingency removal form attached when this document goes back to the buyer. Okay, and so that can be confusing because listing agents don't usually prepare contingency removals, right? It's not really the listing agent's job to prepare a contingency removal. However, in this case, this form says that I'll agree if you remove the contingency subject to the attached contingency removal that I'm giving you to sign. Okay, and so that can be a little confusing. If you are a buyer and you are using this form, you could probably prepare yourself a blank contingency removal, just send it over with the form, don't have your buyer sign it yet, but you're saying to the seller, hey, if you agree to this request, then I will send you a signed version of this contingency removal, right? And so that's where the seller responds. The seller can say, no, they don't agree. They don't have to agree to this request at all. That what happens then? Then the ball is back in the buyer's court and the buyer has to decide what they're going to do. The seller doesn't agree to the request. Or the seller can respond to the request on the attached form, which is the RRR form, which we call the pirate form, RRR. And so the seller says, okay, well, I'm not going to reply to any of these requests, but I'm going to reply in another way. And I'm attaching another form that sets forth how I'm going to reply. And then if the seller agrees, the buyer hereby removes the physical inspection contingency and those identified on the attached contingency removal form and agrees to the above release. And so once again, this form starts at the buyer, it goes to the seller replies, send it back to the buyer, and hopefully at that point there's an agreement. If not, and the seller wants to reply, here is the RRR form, and this is the seller response to the buyer's request for repair. Okay, most of the time, you don't really see a seller's response unless you have one of those situations where there's a lot of requests and a lot of negotiating for repairs. Most of the time, as a buyer's agent, you're trying to summarize everything and you're trying to ask for something that's going to make the seller happy, that's going to make your buyer happy, that you can resolve and get through all your negotiations only once. But sometimes the seller is going to have a response. And so this is the form that they would use. And this is where it says this is how they are going to reply. And they agree to whatever they're going to agree to. Once again, they agree only if the buyer removes the physical inspection contingency or removes those contingencies identified on the attached contingency removal. And then once again, guess what? Here's another spot if the buyer wants to reply back. Okay, so this is a form that, you know, you can negotiate quite a lot on the back and forth with repairs and any other requests. Okay, in our market here in the Bay Area, we usually don't really do this form or use this form very much because we sometimes have all of our home inspections, pest inspections, sewer lateral, roof inspection, like all that stuff is part of our listing package and our listing and disclosure package. And so our buyers tend to make offers using that information that they've been provided. So there's not a lot of this back and forth negotiating that's going to happen during a transaction. Okay, but I know in a lot of other markets, they definitely do a lot more negotiating back and forth. Tatiana says, should I submit an amendment of the buyer changes to the lender while in escrow? Yes, 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 definitely. Yes, if you have changed anything regarding the contract or any kind of amendment or an addendum regarding the contract, those are contract forms and they must be given to the lender, okay? Do not do an amendment or an addendum off to the side that the lender doesn't see. I have had agents tell me that they know other agents do that. Don't do that, that's lender fraud, okay? Any type of contract document that's part of the contract, the lender has to have it, okay? Aris says, should I use an amendment to remove one of the buyer from the purchase agreement? Yeah, actually, I think that is what you should use to remove a buyer from the purchase agreement. I think you should use an amendment. I'll have to look that up. That's a good question. I would probably have to go to my legal resources and find out what the best way is to remove a buyer from a purchase agreement. But I do think an amendment is the form that you need to do that. If that's a real situation, Aris, let me know. I'll look that up. Okay. All right. Let's see. What's the next form? Notice of the buyer to perform. Okay, this is one of the most heated documents in our zip forms library. Nobody wants to get a notice to perform, right? Because that means that you have missed your deadline when you are representing a buyer. And so obviously, if you're representing a buyer, you've got your contingencies. If you miss a deadline, the seller can issue you a notice to perform. And this is what it looks like. You know, this is where the seller hereby gives buyer the notice to, as applicable, remove the specified contingencies and take the specified contractual action as follows. Okay, so this is that form that says, hey, you need to take action. Okay, you haven't performed according to the contract. And what haven't you performed? Well, perhaps you haven't removed your loan contingency, or you haven't removed any one of these other contractual actions, like putting in your initial deposit. Guess what, you guys, when you get into contract and you have a fully executed contract and then that buyer gets cold feet and that buyer doesn't put in their initial deposit, it doesn't mean that that contract is dead. No, no, not at all. You still have to cancel that contract, okay? So that means that the seller would have to give you this notice to perform. You didn't put your initial contract in, and then if you're still not gonna put your initial contract money in, then the seller can give you a cancellation, right? But just because the buyer didn't put their money into escrow doesn't mean that that's a dead contract. It's not. Okay. So
how much notice ahead of time?
Great question.
Notice to perform.
Yep, excellent question. Right here, buyer, if you do not remove the specified contingencies with the contingency removal or a request for repair and take the specified action within 2 days after delivery, but no less than the time specified in the agreement of this notice, buyer to perform, seller may cancel the agreement. Okay, so 2 days, Fidel. It's a
Okay.
2-day notice. Okay. And so that's actually 2 days from the date that you have given it to the other side. And so say that I am a listing agent and my buyer failed to remove a contingency today. Their deadline was yesterday. And so far they haven't done it. Well, then I would immediately be issuing a notice to perform. And because then now they have 2 days within which time frame to go ahead and take that action and remove that contingency. And then if they don't do it, then you can go ahead and unilaterally cancel. Okay, because the buyer failed to take that action. And so then you can prepare a cancellation of contract, and the seller can sign it, and then you can cancel that escrow. And at that point, the deposit money is going to go back to the buyer, okay, because they still had a contingency in place, I'm assuming, which is what they missed here, right? They missed removing their contingency for whatever reason, but they still had the contingency in place. So that means that the seller doesn't have the right to claim their deposit, okay? The only time the seller has the right to claim or make a claim for their deposit is if the contract is completely non-contingent.
Is that classified as a breach of contract?
A breach of contract, meaning in a situation where a contract is completely non-contingent and then the buyer fails to perform and close escrow, is a breach of contract. Yeah.
Okay.
If the buyer fails to perform and close escrow once all the contingency are removed, yes. Okay. So just remember, this is 2 days within your, in order to take action. So a lot of listing agents, especially if there's a situation or a transaction where maybe it's been very difficult, you know, maybe the parties aren't getting along, there's just been a lot of bumps in the road. Maybe you've asked for a bunch of extensions already in your timeframes. And so say that you know that your contingency removal is due on Friday, okay? The listing agent can actually send this to you 2 days in advance. Okay, so the listing agent can send this to you on Wednesday, saying that, you know, we do realize that your contingency removal deadline is Friday. And so we're really hoping that you do it because we're not going to wait any more beyond Friday. So we're going to send you this notice to perform in advance, right? A lot of buyers agents don't like that when the listing agent does that to them. It's like putting them on notice, you know, hey, you know, don't forget your contingency deadline, right? But in certain circumstances, like I said before, if there have already been a bunch of extensions and they're just like frustrated and they don't want to give any more extensions, and they're like, if you don't remove your contingency by this date, then we're going to cancel. Then they can give this this notice to perform in advance, but no more than 2 days in advance. Okay. All right. Does anybody
have you come across with conflict of interest with the deposit in a situation like this? That have you come across that a seller is holding the deposit?
Yeah. First of all, the seller's ability to make a claim on a deposit is going to ultimately be based on whether or not the mediation, arbitration, and liquidated damages clauses were initialed in the contract. Okay, so that's the very first thing I'm going to say is whenever anybody comes to me with a claim or some sort of cancellation drama or some sort of, you know, what's happening with the initial deposit, my very first question is, did both parties initial mediation, arbitration, and liquidated damages? Okay, because you really want to make sure that they're in that contract, you know, so you know how to counsel somebody or you know how to counsel your client. So yes, I mean, say that the buyer is definitely within their rights to cancel, and the buyer goes ahead and perhaps, you know, can't get the loan that they thought that they were going to be able to get. And so they unfortunately can't remove their loan contingency. And so they go ahead and they cancel the contract. They still have that contingency in effect. And the seller is upset The seller does not want that buyer to cancel. That seller wants that buyer to, buy the property. So the seller refuses to sign the release. The buyer definitely does have recourse. The buyer, if for some reason the seller doesn't sign the release and they're holding up the return of that money, the seller can get in trouble. There could be a fine. And that's actually a really good segue into this next form right here, because I'll show you where it says down here. Usually it says a party may be subject to a civil penalty of up to $1,000 for refusal to sign such instructions if no good faith dispute exists as to who is entitled to the funds. Okay. And so that's right there. We did actually have this happen, I want to say a week or two ago, where one of our Radius agents was representing a buyer, exact situation where the buyer unfortunately couldn't get the loan. They still had the loan contingency in effect. They told the listing agent, sorry, we're unable to get the loan that we thought we were qualifying for. And the seller was very, very irate that they didn't want to release the initial deposit. And I had to talk to that agent's broker and just say, hey, we still had a contingency in effect. There's no reason that seller can claim that deposit. And they eventually realized that they needed to release the deposit, and they did. And our buyer got their money back, right? But sellers can be pissy. They can definitely say, hey, well, I feel like I got damaged somehow. And that's why it's really important as agents for us to, make sure we're explaining to our clients, buyers and sellers, what this contingency removal means to them. Okay. All right. This is the cancellation form that you're going to use whenever you cancel a contract. I just want to say really quickly, if you guys ever get to the point where you think a transaction is going to cancel, the very first thing you should remember is, protect yourself in writing with your client. You should probably be advising them in writing to, seek the advice of a qualified California real estate attorney. You never, ever, as an agent, want to be saying who's right and who's wrong. Okay. You don't want to be communicating to the other side who's right and who's wrong, or the seller's fault, or it's the buyer's fault, or anything like that. You really need to be careful in this cancellation scenario, putting things into writing and making accusations. You definitely shouldn't really be counseling your client as far as anything having to do with any drama or stuff that might be happening that they need to talk to an attorney about. Okay. This is the form that you use when you cancel. This is going to say this paragraph is used to cancel the contract by the buyer or seller, or both by mutual agreement. Okay. And so mutual agreement's great, because then later there's never any claim as to who was right and who was wrong. Its terms apply whether or not both parties agree to disposition of the deposit and cancellation of escrow in paragraph 2. And so here's where you put buyer, seller, or both buyer and seller cancel the agreement for the following reason. And usually if you have a contingency, like, according to your inspection contingency or your loan contingency, you would be checking this box. Buyer would be canceling, checking this box, as permitted by the paragraph, whatever paragraph it is. I think inspections is paragraph 14. And so that's where you put per paragraph 14 of the agreement. If they're saying that, based on the findings that I've done in my inspections, I'm not going to buy this property, that's where they would reference that paragraph. Okay, same thing for their loan. If they can't get the loan, the paragraph that you're going to put in here is your loan paragraph. I think it's paragraph 3. I'd have to look at the RPA, but you're referencing that paragraph. Okay. Or you can say seller's canceling because the buyer failed to remove the applicable contingency or take the applicable action after being given a notice to perform. We just talked about a notice to perform. Or the seller has failed to remove a contingency or taken the applicable contractual action after being given a notice to perform. So it's really rare that we have a notice of a seller to perform, isn't it? That's kind of rare. But what would be a circumstance where we, as a buyer, we would want the seller to perform? Maybe they haven't given us the required statutory documents. Maybe they haven't given us the homeowners association documents that are required. Maybe the sellers had a contingency to find a replacement property and they haven't done it yet. You know, there's a form for that. Okay. So there are circumstances where, as a buyer, we could be giving the seller side a notice of the seller to perform, right? The other party has failed to close escrow after being given a demand to close escrow. Okay. That's another form that we can talk about. A demand to close escrow is a form that's only used once you're in a non-contingent contract and a party fails to close. Okay, so that's when you're going to use a demand to close escrow. Okay, or per mutual agreement or whatever. Okay, and then this is where whoever's signing is going to whoever's canceling is going to sign. Okay, and then down here is going to determine how you're releasing your deposit and you're canceling the escrow for the title company. This is where you put in the writing, you know, who canceling the escrow number with whichever title company you have your escrow open at. And then this is where it says seller authorizes the release of buyer's deposit, less buyer's fees and costs to buyer. So obviously the buyer wants this option, right? The buyer wants their money back, right? And so they get confused because they're like, well, what are my fees and costs? And so I know in our neck of the woods up here in Northern California, there aren't usually any fees and costs because our title companies and escrow companies don't charge any fees for upfront escrows or for canceling things or natural hazards reports or anything like that. So most of the time when the buyer cancels, the buyer gets all their money back. Okay, but they did put this less buyer's fees and costs. And so if your buyer gets concerned about what that means, then you can call the title company and you can say, hey, are there any fees and costs, right? And so you need to remember probably not. Or the buyer authorizes the release of the buyer's deposit less seller's fees and costs to seller. Okay, this is pursuant to a properly executed liquidated damages clause. Buyer's authorization of release of deposit to seller is limited to no more than 3% of the purchase price. Okay, any additional deposit shall be returned to buyer. Right, so this is where we get that 3% from. Basically comes from paragraph 21 in the contract, you know, the liquidated damages clause. It's civil code. That's the law that says that if the buyer is buying a residential property 1 to 4 units that they intend to occupy as their primary residence, if they default on that property or fail to close, the most money that they can be liable for is damages is 3% of that contract. Okay, so that's where we get the 3% from. And in this case, if the buyer says they know that they're defaulting and they're going to walk away from trying to get their deposit, then they would check that box and, you know, let the seller have their deposit money. And I've only seen that happen once in my career with some of my clients, where I had a foreign investor who a young woman came and made an offer on a very expensive high-rise condo, removed all of her contingencies. Then her parents came to town and hated it and forced her to not buy the condo, and they lost their 3%. And they just willingly checked this box and basically gave the seller their initial deposit money because they realized that, you know, that they had made a mistake. Okay. Both buyer and seller acknowledge mutual cancellation of the agreement and escrow, but nonetheless authorize escrow holder to continue to hold the deposit until receiving subsequent mutual instructions, judicial decision, or arbitration. Okay, so this box is the box that gets checked when nobody wants to release the money. You know, the seller doesn't want to release the money. So they're going to have to go through either arbitration, mediation, in order to determine how that initial deposit money is going to get returned to which party that is going to get that initial deposit money. Okay. So this form, you know, technically our attorneys don't like us as agents to fill this out. Okay. I have a whole legal advice that I'll post in our practice tips about, you know, canceling the contract. You know, we're as our risk management factor, we're supposed to remember to advise our clients to talk to an attorney. We're not supposed to, you know, say who's right and who's wrong. And actually, we're supposed to not even be filling out this form. We're supposed to give it to them blank. So if you do have a cancellation scenario, you know, it's always really good to call a manager, talk to an advisor, one of our managers, just so we can kind of go through the transaction with you, and we can figure out what the best way to go forward is. Okay. Chat. Kay wants to say, if the lender cannot process the loan on a timely manner per the contract regarding contingency removal date, can the seller request to perform, and what would be the consequences? Yes, the seller can request, can issue a notice to perform if a lender cannot process a buyer's loan in time. And so that actually happens quite a lot. We as buyer's agents will write an offer. I'm always calling my lender, whoever that lender is that that buyer is working with, and I'm asking that lender, like, how long do you anticipate that you're going to need in order to get this client non-contingent, or how long are you going to need in order to fully be able to approve this borrower so that this borrower can remove their financing contingency. Okay, that lender is going to know and give me that time frame, and I'm going to use that time frame in my contract. Most of the time it's usually 17 days, 21 days in my market, depending on which lender I'm talking to. If the lender is unable to perform within that time frame, then I would probably be calling my listing agent, and I would be saying, unfortunately, my lender is running really behind and is really slow. We need some additional time. Can I please have an extension of this contingency? Okay, and there's a form for that. We extend our contingency time frame. Okay, if you extend,
and a case like that would be recommendable to approach another lender?
Yes, Vidal, very good. Good point. I was going to say that. Whenever I feel that my buyer is going to have drama with the lender that we're dealing with, I always recommend that my buyer have a backup plan, right? And especially if maybe my buyer client is insisting on using some lender that I've never heard of, or an online lender, or some resource, off the internet, and they really want to use this lender. We can't force our buyer clients to who to use, obviously, but we can definitely encourage them to have a backup plan, right? And so you can go ahead in this case that Kay is asking about. Yes, if your lender isn't performing in time, then it's like, it's our job as an agent to communicate that to the other agent, but it's also our job to communicate to our buyer how important it is that that buyer be putting pressure on their lender, right? Because it's the buyer's job to basically, to keep their lender who they chose moving forward in a timely manner. And so that's why when I'm communicating with the lender, when I'm writing an offer, I'm CCing my buyer. And I'm saying, hi, Wells Fargo, this is Rebecca. We're going to be writing an offer for Joe. And, Joe's CC'd on the message. We need to find out, what's the time frames for appraisal? How long do you need to get Joe fully approved? How soon can you close an escrow? What's the maximum interest rate that we can put on the contract for Joe's interest rate for his loan? And so I'm always asking these questions before I'm writing the contract, and I'm CCing my buyer, because my buyer needs to know that that lender has to perform according to what they're telling us they can do. And if the lender gets really slow and we ask for extensions, and the seller gives us an extension or two, and then maybe the seller is like, I'm not giving you any more extensions. I'm frustrated with you. I'm just going to give you a notice to perform. And then if the buyer, if the lender still can't, give that borrower assurance that they can, get that loan and remove that loan contingency, then yeah, the seller can cancel.
Do lenders in California, do they issue a letter of loan commitment?
Well, they do. They should be issuing us an approval, right? A loan approval, right? However, a loan approval is going to have. Remember, you have a loan. What's the one before an approval? And you fill out an application and you kind of get somewhat approved, and then you get fully approved. But even though you're fully approved, from an underwriting point of view, they can say you look great on paper, you're fully approved, and you need to make sure that their full approval is taking into consideration all of the verifications that have to happen during underwriting: verification of employment, verification of bank funds, verification of, any other thing that the underwriter is going through, right? So the underwriting process is very detailed, and they're looking at, God knows how much paperwork from the borrower, right? Taxes and anything else they want to ask for. The underwriter can ask for anything. And so just because you've got a pre-approval letter, that's great, but you really want to make sure that all the rest of the stuff has been done too. Okay. And usually the way that the lenders work is they get that borrower through the approval process, and then that file for the borrower goes into the document drawing queue. It goes into the document department, or they take that file now that it's been fully approved, and that's when they start putting together the borrower's paperwork, right? The loan documents. And so usually once your file and your client get to that point where they're putting together the loan documents, you're probably fully approved and okay to remove a loan contingency. But I, as an agent, am not telling my borrower to do that, my client to do that. That's up to the lender. So I'm always saying to the lender, hey, can your client remove the loan contingency? And let the lender answer that. That's the lender's job, to assure them of that. Okay. They're probably never, ever going to assure that in writing. They're going to do it verbally, right? Okay, they're going to say to the client, oh yeah, you're all set, you're good to go, you can remove your loan contingency, you're fully approved, right? Okay. Oh, a pre-qual letter, that was it. That was what I was trying to think of. So you have pre-qual letter, okay, you're qualified. Pre-approval is, oh, it looks pretty good. And then full approval is, yes, we verified all your documents, right? Okay, you guys, what time is it? 10:30.
My real question is, when the bank is done with the process of the loan and they approve it, they know that they're going to issue the funds. How do we know? Would they write a letter of loan commitment, or they inform us verbally?
They usually just do it verbally at that point. Yeah.
Okay.
They usually do it verbally. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yep. So I know it's 10:30. Let's do really quickly. I want to just show you a couple more things, you guys, and then you can ask any questions. Go over in here back to zip forms. I'm not a zip forms trainer, but I've been obviously using zip forms enough times that I want to just show you how to find things really quickly in zip forms that will be helpful to you. There are so many forms. I probably could talk, a lot longer on all the forms, but just really quickly show you a couple of things on how to find answers to questions. If you need to do things on your own and you want to find answers to questions. Here's my zip forms. Here is the example transaction. When you're creating transactions in zip forms, you always want to create a new transaction. Okay, don't use an old transaction and copy it. Okay, because every time you create a new transaction, zip forms is pulling the new versions of the forms. Okay, so you can go ahead if you want to set yourself up some templates. You can teach yourself how to do templates, but don't go to an old transaction and copy it. Okay, make sure you're using a new transaction all the time. These are all the libraries that I have access to because I belong to so many associations. And so if you guys ever need any documents from a different county, Contra Costa or Marin, or Solano or San Francisco or anything like that, email me and I'll send you the blank forms because I have access to all these forms. The other thing to show you is that as agents, you have this right here, the e-publications. You have all of these publications that you have access to if you ever have questions about, short sales or green living or consumer guides. Like sometimes if a consumer has a question about, disclosure requirements for sellers or, anything like that. Here's one for SB 800 having to do with, new construction. Here are all your protect your family from all your natural hazard stuff. Okay, so I want to call your attention to that. I also want to call your attention to sample letters. This is really fun. Here are some sample letters. Okay, these are not forms, they're more sample letters for scenarios that you might you might come across access to premises, abandoned personal property, a buyer's demand for deposit when the seller cancels, confirmation of a conversation that you've had with somebody, a demand to close, demand to perform, fence repair, demand that seller vacate, so these are all things that are in here that if for any reason you have a crazy situation, you can of course always call a manager and talk about your crazy situation, but sometimes you have these sample letters here. Keep in mind, once again, you guys were not attorneys. And so if we ever have a situation where there's some sort of legal thing happening, we can't, obviously give legal advice. All right. But it's interesting to kind of read through these sample letters. Okay. And then the last thing I wanted to show you before we finish up is this forms. Let's see, let's use this one as an example, request for repair. And then a lot of people up here, they don't ever pay attention to this. This is called the forms tutor option. And so if you go into a document and you maybe have a question about how to use the document, like I was just in the request for repair, you can click on forms tutor and forms advisor. And so forms advisor is going to take you, if you click on this, it's going to take you to this question and answer sheet. It's an agent, you can answer all the questions, and then the zip forms library is going to auto populate forms that you need for your scenario. Okay. I don't use that one very often. You can, obviously, just because zip forms says that you need to use the form, you're still going to want to comply with our compliance requirements on Radius's side. Okay. But I do always use the forms tutor option, and I'll show you what that looks like if you guys haven't played around with this yet. This is going to give you these forms, and then CAR goes through these different forms. They've only done 43, so not every form has a forms tutor option, but most of the forms will have the kind of the ones that you have a lot of questions about, like the additional agent acknowledgement, will have a tutor option. And so what that means is you can click on it, like we already talked about this one this morning, but you can click on it. And so this is what the form looks like. It's obviously a sample, it's watermarked for the sample. You can click on the blue dot and it gives you information about the form. Okay. And so it's just really super, super handy. If you ever have, like, say for instance, where was our request for repair, extension of time, anything that this one, the request for repair, once again, can be really confusing. And so if you click on it, this little forms tutor, will give you all the things that you need to know about that form. Okay. All right. So I kind of talked about this today, but you can read through this if you ever want to go to your forms advisor. Always a really, really good spot to use for answering your own questions. Here's an RPA. We're obviously going to be doing away with this in a couple of months. I just clicked on it and it didn't do anything. Oh, here we go. No, it didn't do anything. It gives you the, let's go back and see if it'll do it again. I don't want to click back into it, but what it'll do is if you go to Forms Advisor and you click on the RPA, it's going to give you all those like bullet points for each different paragraph. Okay. Keep in mind though, since we are talking about it, I don't know if you guys were here for last week when I was talking, I know some of you were, but we do have the new RPA that's coming out in December for 2022. And so I'm going to encourage you to please get ready for this. This is what it looks like, 16 pages of a new purchase contract, okay? So I'm gonna probably be doing training on this as we go, but you as agents should also be trying to, find out and teach yourself some of these things so that when it comes time to transition over into the new RPA, you guys will have all that.